Thank you for joining us today for Inclusive Pathways and Broadening Participation for Native Americans in the Language Sciences. I'm Colleen Fitzgerald, one of the co-organizers of this panel, and I'll be providing introductory remarks. Wesley Leonard, the other co-organizer, will be closing the session with some discussion as well. I'm coming to you from North Dakota State University in my office, and so I'd like to offer the NDSU land acknowledgement in recognition of the land on which we stand. We collectively acknowledge that we gather at NDSU, a land grant institution, on the traditional lands of the Ochatee, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Anishinaabe peoples, in addition to many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to these lands. We honor with gratitude Mother Earth and the Indigenous peoples who have walked with her throughout generations. We will continue to learn how to live in unity with Mother Earth and build strong, mutually beneficial, trusting relationships with Indigenous peoples of our region. So the goals of today's organized session are listed on this slide. First, to raise awareness of the kinds of challenges to drawing in more Indigenous scholars to the discipline, to lay groundwork for moving from beyond merely increasing the numbers of Indigenous scholars to a larger need for transformative change in the discipline itself, to provide takeaways for participants, including concrete strategies for collaboratively generating institutional transformation, and to enable the audience to consider how to scale or adopt such initiatives at their own home institutions. So the overview of these introductory remarks, I'm going to start by talking about the National Science Foundation and broadening participation, then give representation for address representation in terms of Native Americans and Native Hawaiians, then talk about inclusion as opposed to representation, and then provide a snapshot of the panel. So in terms of National Science Foundation, it's important to know it's a significant federal funder in the United States and a major funder of social, behavioral, and economic sciences research. It has dedicated funding programs relevant to the language sciences, including the NSF Dynamic Language Infrastructure, NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, documenting endangered languages. So DLI-DEL is what people often call it. So DLI-DEL was, it started its first awards in 2005, and it's a complex partnership with programs from 4 different directorates at NSF and 2 different divisions at NEH participating. It's got a track record of building capacity to increase representation of Native Americans as principal investigators, or PIs, including through grant writing workshops. And I have a reference here from Susan Penfield's paper in 2012 reporting on precisely the results of a grant writing workshop that this program funded. I think it's also important to note that meritorious projects funded by DLI-DEL were selected from the gold standard of NSF merit review, intellectual merit or advancing knowledge, and broader impacts benefiting society. So the same standards that are used for any NSF project, the same merit review criteria, are used for DLI-DEL projects. This particular program has also historically attracted interest in Native American languages, including from tribal nations. And given that, there's an opportunity to increase participation and representation by Native Americans and Native Hawaiians in the language sciences. Broadening participation is a term that's defined by the National Science Foundation as representation of groups and institutions traditionally underrepresented in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM. And linguistics is included in that definition of STEM, linguistics being one of the fields that NSF funds. So broadening participation represents efforts to increase representation of those underrepresented. So when we're talking about representation for the language sciences, well, we can start by more generally noting the pretty dramatic underrepresentation of Native Americans in undergraduate education, as they're earning at best 1% of the bachelor's degrees in each of the broad science and engineering fields. So 1% or fewer of the degrees earned in psychology and the other social sciences. If we look specifically at national science, at linguistics, these earned degree this chart from earned degrees is coming from NSF data from the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics from 2021. And they cover from 2008 to 2018, and you see a slight increase from 500 majors graduating in 2008 to 702 in 2018. But during this same time period, there's only 1 year where the combined number of American Indians or Alaska Natives or Native Hawaiians or other Pacific Islanders exceed 10, and that's in 2015. So in other words, there's still very small numbers of Native Americans and Native Hawaiians earning degrees in linguistics, and this is bachelor's degrees. At this chart, which is coming from the Linguistic Society of America and their annual report from 2020, you see both in the first column and the fourth column from the left that there's dramatic underrepresentation of these same groups, and this is coming from those NSF data broken down for linguistics, and that's 2019, so this is just 1 year. But if we look at the self-identification of LSA members, we see even among self-identification of the 3,308 members in the database in January 2021, there's only 23 that are identifying in these groups. So we see there is pretty dramatic underrepresentation of Indigenous people, specifically Indigenous people of North America, in the language sciences. So we can look at representation, but we can also look at inclusion. Is there a space that's welcoming and inclusive for Indigenous scientists? Speaking of the language sciences, Charity Hudley et al. In 2020 article argue that those disciplines that have focused more on developing race as a theoretical concept and interdisciplinary fields that center engagement with race and racism, that language sciences might benefit from those kinds of moves that we've seen in sociology, anthropology, or in Indigenous studies. Following up in that collection of papers, this is a collection of papers in the journal Language, volume 96, issue 4, which went from that Charity Hudley et al. Article and then had response papers, including Wesley Leonard's. Wes discusses a critical approach, inclusion in terms of a critical approach in which linguists recognize diverse epistemologies and research methodologies and thoughtfully select their approach for a given research need from this larger pool. So in other words, it's not just that you've got Indigenous language scientists, it's that the methodologies, it's that the epistemologies are coming from also diverse perspectives as well. So there's a number of ways in which people talk about greater inclusion in the language sciences and how that could diversify not just the scholars in this field, but also the scholarship itself. And so I think that's really what we're trying to drive home in talking about inclusive approaches and the generation of new knowledge. So I'm going to provide a snapshot of the panel in terms of the topics that we're covering within these broad themes, because it is really designed to have participants think about the various trajectories, the various stages along the career trajectory from undergraduate into academia. So the first four talks are focusing on undergraduate studies. The first one will address the syllabus. The second one will cover undergraduate research, and the next two talks will address partnerships with tribal colleges and native serving institutions. Then we will turn to several talks that are on graduate studies. There will be 2 talks on master's programs or master's and graduate certificate programs, and then a talk on near-peer mentoring. And then turning to the professorate and sustaining all these career stages for Indigenous scholars, there will be a talk on grant writing, another one on professional development, and finally a talk on mentoring. We'll then have a discussion and response session. So Dr. Karen Rice will talk about implications and gaps, and then Dr. Wesley Leonard will close out the session in response and talking about Indigenous inclusion. And we'll then have some time for questions and answers from the audience. Thank you.